Hello, everybody. It's really odd because I can't see you. So I'm just imagining you all out there eating your lunch. And welcome to the last IIRSM webinar before Christmas, hence the Sprout shirt. My name's Tim Sisney. I am a process and productivity consultant. My business, Make Work Better, focuses on how we can design well-being into our work. And ISO 45003 cropped up more or less kind of at the time that I was starting my business, and it was has been very helpful because it starts to codify how the way we work impacts our well-being. So to be clear, I'm not a risk management expert or a health and safety expert. I'm a my particular area of interest is how the way that we work impacts our mental health. And what I'm here today to do is kind of introduce you to ISO 45003 from the perspective of the impact that it has on organizations and the possible impacts that it could have for you in your roles as risk and safety professionals, how you may want to think about approaching it, where there are overlaps with what you're already used to, and where there are things that might be slightly different, or where you might need to grow new skills or bring in other expertise in order to land this stuff. Really happy to take questions at the end. Really looking forward to hearing a little of your experience. And if there's anything that crops up during the course of the session, yeah, just drop a note in the questions bit, and Sue will loop us back to those later on. So I'm going to share my screen. I do have slides, so we'll take a look at that, and hopefully you can still see me, because it is all about me. So ISO 45003, why do we have it? Well, these are the figures from the HSE that were published in 2021. So this is the 2020-2021 figures around stress, anxiety, and depression in the workplace. And I guess the important thing for us to notice on this is that it's not getting better. That figure's gradually going up to the top right-hand corner. And what we're seeing now is that stress, anxiety, and depression in the workplace is by far the largest contributor to sickness absence. So it's something that has been growing, and has been, we are aware, and everyone knows has been growing in the workplace, but the impact that it is having on businesses, on employees, on the economy is increasing and is huge. And I guess why are we saying this? I guess we're saying this because it's something that gets talked about, it's something that gets mentioned, but actually being put into the context of other health impacts, adverse health impacts at work, is kind of why ISO 45003 exists. There's no new legislation, nothing has changed in the area of health and safety, apart from the fact that it's just mental health hasn't ever really been specifically focused on, and that's where ISO 45003 slightly changes things and starts to specifically put some frameworks about how mental health, stress, anxiety, and depression, and our well-being at work is affected by the way we work, and how you can use more traditional health and safety approaches in order to help with that. Some other figures. So again, during and these have been pulled from various different sources, from the HSE, or from a business in the community, or from Gallup, but nearly half of employees have experienced mental health symptoms which they say have been caused or worsened by work in the last year. That was from the business and community at the end of last year. Managers have started to report higher levels of burnout. Working hours have increased, and I think there's something interesting in this around the way that hybrid working and working from home, those kind of things, have started to muddy the waters a little bit on the way that we think, the way we work, and the hours that we work, and the way that we respond to our work, because those boundaries are getting thinner. And without support, people aren't going to are less likely to create their own boundaries until it's too late. And 76% of people believe their company should be doing more to protect the mental health of their workforce. Okay, now that's the one that I want to Chris, I really want to focus on that word protect, because something that's going to run throughout the course of this is that much of what we do for well-being and for mental health in the workplace isn't protecting, it's responding to or reacting to. So thinking about you as risk management professionals, and your special power, your skill set is in the protective element of it as opposed to the reactive element of it, then that's where ISO 45003 and what we're going to talk about today has such a big impact. So Gallup identified 5 top causes of stress at work, and I think these are really interesting because they make a lot of sense when you read them, but they're also things that we don't really think about as being related to mental health generally. Yeah, so unreasonable time pressure and workload are ones that we think about. We would assume they're the ones that people tend to sort of go straight to. If you think about what causes stress at work, it's having too much work to do and not enough time to do it. But the other 3 that are in there I find really interesting because they're far more about people. You know, they're far more about how we interact with each other, and they're far more about the expectations that organizations set of their people. So going from the bottom upwards, a lack of communication and support from their manager, huge impact. You know, we've all heard the cliche, you don't leave a job, you leave a boss. I don't know how true that really is in from data terms, but from my experience of things that have impacted my mental health when I've been working in organizations, it has often been to do with communication or management support. As a process management, process improvement professional consultant, one of the things that I notice a lot is that there is always an element of communication in improvements. Any kind of improvement plan you put together will always have some element of communication in there. And often it's not what it's often a larger proportion of it than what people are expecting beforehand. Lack of role clarity is a massive thing. Do you understand what your role is, and do you understand what other people's roles are, and do you understand how those things fit together? Because any degree of uncertainty, any degree of ambiguity can be really, really unsettling for people. And also, so that ties into the lack of communication and management support. And unfair treatment at number 1, I think, is really interesting because it never comes up. You just whenever I've done this as a workshop where people are kind of putting post-its on the wall and things like that, fairness rarely comes out. But the idea that maybe, you know, and I think it's related to ambiguity and role clarity. I think it's related to communication. It's related to leadership capabilities and all of those things. But people not feeling they're being treated fairly at work is a huge cause of stress, a huge cause of mental health difficulty. So these 5 things feel really addressable. They feel like things that we can do something about. But more often than not, the things that we put in place around stress, mental health at work don't really touch any of these. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. Now, putting all those, there's a great book called Dying for a Paycheck by Jeffrey Pfeffer, which I was going to wave at you, but I've left it downstairs, so I'm not going to do that now. But I'd highly recommend it if you're interested in diving into some of the data on this. Now, it's based on a lot of US data, but so there's a lot of stuff in there about health, provision of healthcare and things like that, which is less relevant in this country at the moment, but is certainly what I found really interesting was this set of charts where he's done a kind of meta-analysis of a bunch of different research studies and benchmarked those things that we've just talked about, the things that do impact people's mental health, and he's benchmarked it against exposure to secondary smoke, which I find absolutely fascinating because exposure to secondary smoke is something that we know has an impact on our health, and we know that there's a direct causal link. So being able to say, right, compared to secondary smoke, if you have poor work-life balance, you are much more likely to report poor physical health as a result of stress. Work-life balance impacts people's perception of their own physical health far worse than exposure to secondary smoke. He also did it for poor mental health. So I'm looking, and when you look at what's on this, on the chart here, work-life balance is obviously huge, but fear of unemployment, high job demands, and unfairness, again, all have a greater adverse impact than exposure to secondary smoke for people's mental health. And then this is the one that I find really fascinating. This isn't just about people's self-reported feeling. This is about the likelihood of a physician-diagnosed health condition. And secondary smoke exposure, which we know is, we have whole laws. We've changed entire cultures to avoid people being exposed to secondary smoke. But unfairness at the workplace, high job demands, shift work. So that whole the whole impact of the circadian rhythms being disrupted by shift work, and a fear of unemployment are all coming out higher in this study than against secondary smoke exposure. So there's something very real going on here around the way that our work is designed, the way that our work, the way that we are treated at work, the way that our work impacts us and our mental health. It's a very real thing. It's, as we've seen in the figures, that it's more likely to make you actually ill, but it's all more likely to lead to time off. We've heard a lot about quiet quitting over this last year. So engagement of your employees and the actual productivity of employees directly impacted by the way that we treat our employees and the way that we design the work that we're asking them to do. Hence the reason for ISO 45003 and this framework. So I like to think about workplace well-being along two axes, which is that axis we've already talked about between prevention of injury versus helping people recover from injury that's already happened. And on this the vertical axis, I like to think about where are we expecting the individual to do things for themselves, and where is the organization doing its bit? And I don't even think it's arguable. I think it's fairly clear that most of the stuff that we do in the workplace for well-being happens in the bottom left of this chart. It's all about helping individuals recover from an impact. So if you think about resilience training or mental health first aiders, or lunchtime yoga, or any of the other sort of initiatives that organizations put in place, reminders to drink water, those sort of things, it's very focused on the individual. It's very focused on, these are the things the individual could or should be doing in order to improve their own well-being. And most of the time, they are responding to something that's already happened. We also need to be, that's important, and I always have to make sure that I'm not saying that any of that stuff that organizations are already doing is completely pointless and they should stop doing it, but we also need to be, in the top right of this chart, we also need to be thinking about, as organizations, organizationally, what could we be doing to prevent getting there in the first place? And the thing is, we're really, really good at that for physical injury. If you, and you all know this better than I do, okay, and that's the reason you're here, the reason that you're involved with IIRSM is, as an industry, risk and safety management has absolutely smashed it in reducing injury and fatalities in the workplace, physical injury and fatalities in the workplace. That curve that I showed you at the start goes in completely the opposite direction if you look at it for physical injuries. So we know that it works. We know that taking that organizational preventative approach works in reducing harm to our employees. We just don't do it for mental health. And so ISO 45003 explicitly gives us a framework in order to enable us to think about mental health in these terms. Now, before we get into it, I just want to talk about some terms, make some distinction, because these two do get mixed up a little bit, if you like. They get confused, and it's just important for us to make really, really clear what these terms are from the point of view of for what we're going to talk about in a moment. So psychological safety is all about the ability to raise concerns, say things, ask questions without fearing that it will result in negative consequences. Okay, so when we talk about psychological safety in a team, that's where there is a culture of questioning the status quo, where you have leaders who are open to being challenged, where there isn't a sense that of toxic hierarchy or any of those things, and that if you are able to speak out and whistleblow, if you like, those things are we know that they will not result in negative consequences. That's what psychological safety is, and the safety is not related to the safety in health and safety. Okay, so when we talk, if you hear people talking about psychological safety, generally it's not related to what we're talking about from a point of view of ISO 45003 and this approach to well-being in the business. It's hugely important. Building psychological safety in the culture at an organization is a huge foundation or pillar within creating a culture where mental health is supported and people feel able to challenge the things that could lead to psychosocial risk. Psychosocial risk is the term that we use when we're discussing potential hazards to mental health. So that could come from the design of work or interpersonal interaction or the working environment, and these are the risks that we need to take into account from a health and safety perspective. So psychosocial risk is really what we're talking about today, and what we're going to be what ISO 45003 helps us to identify and to treat like physical risks, physical hazards. Psychological safety, very important, but isn't directly related. So we just need to be a bit careful about the distinction between those two terms. And I kind of think that probably if we were coming up with a term for psychological safety now, we might use a different term because of the confusion. But yeah, so just wanted to get that out there. What we're going to be talking about is psychosocial risk. So hopefully you're all familiar with these two pieces of legislation. If there's anyone from outside the UK on the call, I've not seen the list, but if there's anyone from outside the UK, apologies, this is a little bit UK centric, but we'll get out. This is the only bit that's specific, not geographically just specific. But kind of to make the point, I guess, a little bit about where ISO 45003 fits in, and where the kind of legislative where there's the legal requirements on organizations. Nothing has changed from that perspective. Okay, so Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 talks about organizations being responsible for the health, safety and welfare of their employees. Okay, it doesn't say anything about mental health. It also doesn't say anything about respiratory health or musculoskeletal health. It's just mental health hasn't been considered as a part of that until fairly recently. And so there is but nothing is different in the law. It's always been protected legally, and been expected that mental health and safety in the workplace for employees' mental health is covered as a part of that. Similarly, the management of health and safety at work regulations around risk assessments, requiring employers to carry out risk assessments and provide information and training, also doesn't not apply to mental health. And we have things like the management standards and the stress risk assessments and those kind of things. But I think it's fair to say that risk assessments around hazards to one's mental health are nowhere near as common or as understood or as focused as kind of risk assessments that we would do around things that could injure someone physically. So those two are still the pillars of everything we're talking about, and the mental health angle of them is implicit, but has been, if not ignored, certainly sort of hand waved away for the last 30 odd years. So ISO 45001 is the ISO standard for occupational health and safety management systems from 2018. It's not something I understand it. I know what it is. I'm not an expert in ISO 45001, and most of you are probably much better versed in what that is and does than I am. But what ISO 45001 does is it provides the foundation and the framework for ISO 45003. So ISO 45003 is a child standard of ISO 45001. As a result, it's actually quite readable and quite approachable as a standard, because all of the hard stuff's in ISO 45001, and ISO 45003 kind of therefore I think has a bit more of a space to breathe around the kind of things that it's talking about. It is available to read for free on the ISO website. So if if you want to have a bit of a review of that after the session, or maybe you've already done that, it is available. It's reasonably short and it's reasonably readable, to be perfectly honest, and provides lots and lots of examples of the kind of things that we're going to be talking about in order to just kind of help you start to, it's not an exhaustive list by any means, but it's pretty thorough. So ISO 45003 is kind of the layer that sits on top of ISO 45001. That sits on top of the health and safety legislation in whichever geography you happen to be in. But certainly, so far as the UK is concerned, none of that legislation has needed to change in order for ISO 45003 to continue to be relevant, or to start to be relevant. And so, as I say, some of ISO 45003 will be familiar. Okay, it's a child standard of ISO 45001, which talks about management systems. The idea being that if you have a health and safety management system that is ISO 45001 compliant, then ISO 45003 will just slot straight in. To be honest, the way that ISO 45003 recommends you work, whatever your health and safety management system is, it should be able to adapt to treating your psychosocial risk in the same way as your physical risk. So that's something that should be familiar to you generally, and should be a comfortable area. And similarly, the concept of risk assessment, the idea of looking at something that could potentially cause a potential hazard, or something that could potentially cause injury, and thinking about it from the perspective of how likely is that injury to occur, and how severe is that injury likely to be, and therefore giving it a risk a risk score as a result, a risk profile as a result. And ISO 45003 is a guidance standard, so it can't be accredited to. It can't be. It's not something that you can win or whatever. But there is a certificate. So the certification arm of the BSI offer their own certification. There was a lot of clamoring for that to be available, and I'm sure that fairly soon that globally there will be other organisations offering their own version of this. But there's no official accreditation to ISO 45003. And this is something else that's going to be familiar. So you're going to know this better than I know it, okay? And apologies if my example is trite or indeed wrong, but the hierarchy of risk reduction still applies, okay? So the idea that there is a way of looking at risk and looking at ways of reducing risk that are gradually moving you away from removing the risk and more towards protecting people from being impacted by the risk. It still applies. So if we run through this very quick example, again, apologies if it's very childish. If we're thinking about like fumes from painting a car, so what we might do is we say, well, let's not paint the cars. Okay, that's not really going to cut it for most of the time, but that would eliminate the risk completely. So we could paint the cars with something else, something less harmful. Okay, and what we're talking about there is removing or reducing risk. Then we're getting into engineering controls, which is, as you all know, is all about the changing the way that the process works in order to reduce exposure to risk. So this might be to improve ventilation in the painting area. Administrative controls, the way I sort of understand those, is it's more about influencing people's behavior. So you're kind of relying on people to behave in a certain way in order to, or trying to control the way that people behave in order to reduce the exposure to risk. So that would be, okay, we're only going to allow employees to work in the painting area for a maximum of 50 minutes at a time to reduce their exposure to that risk. Okay, so it's it's probably effective, but it can be worked around. If you've got a unscrupulous manager or an employee who wants a bit of extra work or just not enough people, all those kind of things could sort of fall down around those kind of controls. Then finally, protective equipment. So give everybody gas masks. And in that situation, and I think this is the way I like to phrase it for when we move into looking at mental health. In that situation, you are accepting that your environment is harmful. You're accepting that actually what's surrounding us here is likely to cause injury, and so therefore we need to give you protective equipment. And there are some jobs where if you're a firefighter, then ultimately you're going to have to go into a building probably that's on fire, and we can't make the fire less burny, so we're going to have to give you some to stop you inhaling smoke. But you are accepting that the environment is harmful. So let's think about it from the point of view of psychosocial risk. And the example that I'm working with this here, which is from some work that I did earlier this year and end of last year. The marketing team worked long and stressful hours around campaign launches. Okay, so we've got a team of people whose work is causing them to work long hours, and it's very, very stressful, and therefore they're finding it difficult. So thing number one: can we reduce the number of marketing campaigns? Can we change? Can we eliminate anything? Can we change anything about the way that we do these things so they're not having to do this as much? Potentially, in substitution, we might simplify things. Maybe the way that they're doing these things, maybe they're extremely complex and require a lot of work, and maybe we could be doing a bit more sort of like just social media marketing and making it a bit simpler and taking away all the stressful stuff. So substituting some of the things for things that are less stressful might be fine. It might not be what the business needs from its marketing team. So then we get into, and this is where I've changed one of the things, rather than engineering controls, at this level, I like to think about work design. So again, it's a similar kind of concept. What we're saying here is we are changing the way that the work works in order to reduce the likelihood of exposing the people to risk. So what in the physical world might be an electronic shut-off or something similar, this is about thinking about the processes, thinking about the resourcing, thinking about how the work is designed. And in this situation, we would review the processes the team are using. Are they the most effective process they could be, or are they fighting against the work? Maybe the systems they're using are not up to scratch, or make things longer, or make things more difficult. And potentially, could you bring admin resource into the team around these areas? So increase the size of the team during times in order to alleviate some of the stress. So thinking about the way the work is designed, for me, is kind of analogous to your engineering controls in physical risk. Administrative controls, same kind of thing, where you're talking about you're relying on people working the way that you are asking them to work. You're trying to put things in place that will influence people's behavior. So for me, this would be about improving team working practice and working standards. So that could be, all right, how do we communicate as a team? And maybe introducing daily stand-up meetings, or some kind of collaboration where that will enable teams to exchange information more easily. Maybe introducing some standards such as, okay, everybody gets to have an hour for lunch, and we respect that, and we don't book meetings during people's lunch hour, so at least people get time to decompress during a day. Maybe it's about how quickly we as a team are going to respond to email, or what's expected of the team in the way that they work. So the sort of thing, so it's a little bit similar to the example earlier. You can't really, it's not a physical control, it's relying on everybody buying into a change of behavior. but can be very effective in reducing the exposure to risk. They just can also break down easily if people stop doing it. And finally, well-being interventions. So the pointy bit of our triangle here is your resilience training, your mental health first aiders, your yoga, your fruit baskets. It's the stuff that we do once we've accepted that our environment is harmful. And again, this stuff is important, and we need to make sure that we're doing it in order to provide that remedial support. But it's only of any use once people are broken. And what we're doing is enabling them to cope in an environment which is potentially damaging to their health. So for me, that's how the hierarchy of risk reduction maps onto psychosocial risk. And so much of the focus of the way that we talk about well-being in organizations at the moment is at that pointy end, in the psychosocial equivalent of PPE. So I'm going to do about another 10 minutes, something like that, and talk about ISO 45003 specifically, and then hopefully we can get some questions in the last 10-15 minutes, and we can take you through like that. So ISO 45003, the standard, is broken out into 3 sections. So how work is organized, social factors, and environment and hazardous working. So we'll kind of work through each of those individually, just talk about some of the things that we see in those. So how work is organized, this is sort of my bread and butter bit. This is the bit that I really like, because this is where I get to go in and help people change how work is organized, hence the name of my business. Excuse me a moment. So, and if you go back to thinking about those 5 things that that were identified in that Gallup poll as being like the major contributors of stress in the workplace, you can start to understand why some of the stuff here is here. So roles and expectations. Do I understand what my job is? Do I understand what your job is? Do I understand how the 2 things fit together? Do I understand what is expected of me by my manager? Do I understand what is expected of me by other people? That degree of clarity is a much bigger piece than I think a lot of people, a lot of organizations expect it is around well-being and mental health impacts. So there can be an awful lot. If you think about a time when you've not felt clear about your role or the expectations on you and how that made you feel. It can contribute to duplication of work, which leads people to feel that their work is meaningless. It can lead to concerns about job security, which, from the FEFA stuff, we saw as that being quite high in the impact that it has on people. Because if you can think, well, if I'm doing that, but I thought he's doing that, but I thought that was my job. So what does that mean for my role? And if you don't understand what's expected of you, it's very difficult to perform in a way which is expected of you, which then leads to that whole leadership impact dichotomy, where people aren't performing in the way that they people don't know what's expected of them in order to be able to perform in the way that they want to. Now that last one bleeds over nicely into job control or autonomy. A really good book on this that's a very fast read and really interesting is Drive by Daniel Pink. Some of you may have come across it already, but he talks a lot in there about intrinsic motivation, and autonomy is so he talks about mastery, so being really good at something, autonomy, doing something the way that you want to do it, and purpose, so being part of, feeling like you're contributing to something bigger than yourself, as the 3 things that we need for intrinsic motivation to feel like our work is meaningful. So having a degree of job control or autonomy over our role is hugely important to us. You talk about people complaining about being micromanaged, or bosses who don't feel like they trust their people. Hugely demoralizing, and can really lead to strong links to anxiety, and strong links to if you feel like you aren't able to do the job the way you want to do it, it makes you less, it often makes you less likely to want to do it well, because you're kind of, well, I'm just going to tick a box and then we're into quiet quitting. So job control or autonomy, hugely overlooked, again, in the way that people think about how work impacts mental health. Job demands, so what is the job asking of you? Very closely tied to workload and work rhythm or work pace. Actually, is the work a reasonable expectation to be asking somebody to do? Is the team sized appropriately? All of those things. That's the stuff that everybody naturally drifts towards from the perspective of work. And the response a lot of the time within businesses is, well, that's what we need. It's the nature of the job. That's something that that's what we expect. People just need to crack on and deliver what we need them to deliver. We're a business after all. We're here to make money, whatever the cliche is that gets rolled out. A way to think about that, a way to think about job demands, workload, and work rhythm is that if that were a factory and your people were pieces of machinery, there would be a very clear throughput for that machinery. We'd know exactly how many pieces each bit of machinery could make, and every single one of those machines would get preventative maintenance to make sure it could keep operating at optimum efficiency. And if our people are as important as we say they are in our businesses, why don't we treat them as well as we treat our machines? Why don't we recognize what's a realistic output from a person, and why don't we make sure that we're giving them the preventative maintenance in order to enable them to maintain an optimum output, as opposed to sizing our production based on what we've sold and what we need to do and expecting people to work into the night in order to deliver the job demands, because that's how you break people and that's how your production line breaks down. Other areas on this one that I want to just call out, change and job security, very, very closely linked. Change management I think things are getting better with change management in organizations. I actually said that on one of these webinars a little while ago, and then P&O sacked a bunch of people by Zoom. So, what do I know? But the way that you manage change in your organization is really, really important for the mental health of your people. The uncertainty surrounding change, whether it's massive, company restructures where people are going to lose their jobs, or whether it's just like, you're changing where someone sits. If you don't manage those things well, it can be really, really disconcerting for people. And small changes can have much bigger psychological impacts for the size of the change than people really realize. Particularly where it comes to this idea of the psychological contract. So the things that the employees expect of the organization versus the things that the organization gives to them, this sort of unwritten psychological contract. You break that, you start to lose your people, and the people can start to get anxious and stressed very easily. So that's some of this isn't an exhaustive list. Like I said, these are the main topic areas that fall under how work is organized. But you can start to see how it's not necessarily just about how much work we're asking people to do. It's about the way that the work is designed and whether the people are fighting their work or whether the work is enabling people to do their best job. Social factors are not just about the ones in the bottom right. It's not just about violence at work and harassment and bullying. Okay, they're the ones that get the headlines, and of course they're a massive thing. But the things that are happening more frequently and more commonly are things around, are your leaders behaving in the ways that you want your leaders to behave? Do you have opportunities for career development, and do people feel supported within the business? Are interpersonal relationships healthy? Do people have that level of psychological safety that we talked about earlier? This time of year, very difficult from that perspective. Is it okay for someone to not go to the Christmas party? What kind of pressures are put on those people? Some people will be absolutely dreading that. But is that being considered in the way that teams are run and the way that teams interact? Do people have the right level of supervision, which is not always going to be the same for everybody? And are people afforded civility and respect at work? Because again, those are the kind of things that can contribute over time to stress and depression, because people don't feel like they're valued. I'm just aware of time. I think I've talked too long on the last slide, so I'm going to move along fairly quickly. This one's really interesting because it ties directly into work that you're probably more familiar with generally. So you're thinking about hazardous environments and hazardous tasks and the equipment that we have to. So to start with, do we have the equipment we need to do our job, or is that making it more difficult for people to do their job? And then it's about remembering that for every physical risk that you mitigate for, around an environment or people working with hazardous tasks, there is very possibly a related psychosocial risk. So someone, say, who works with toxic chemicals, for example, there may be a big risk assessment around, avoiding the fact that, chemical leak and people being exposed to hazardous chemicals, and there'll be lots of process and risk assessment around that. But also there should be a risk assessment around what psychological impact does it have on those people having to do that work. Just because that it's as safe as it can possibly be, it doesn't mean that people aren't worried about it. And what impact does that have on how they feel when they come to work? Because those are the sort of underlying kind of background anxiety feelings that can mount up over time, and we don't really always consider them. So this area of the standard very much around where are people working, what equipment is available to them working, and what are they working with, and how does that relate to the way that they are, to the way they feel about the work that they do. So far we've talked about what's similar with ISO 45003, the things that you will probably be will feel, they map very nicely onto what you do now. There are a couple of things I want to talk about that are different, and then we'll look at getting some questions. The first is that unfortunately there is still a stigma and a taboo around mental health. It is reducing. People are talking about it more, but it's still very difficult. That stigma and taboo is also different across different demographic groups. So unfortunately, men, for example, still find it very difficult to talk about mental health. Also, culturally, it's more or less taboo in different cultures. So we need to be aware that we're not going into something which everybody's comfortable talking about. So we need to find ways to introduce the questions, the risk assessments, those kind of things. And this is where actually being approached from a risk assessment, an objective risk assessment perspective, is, I think, more helpful, because people are able to potentially engage with it a little bit more, and you're talking to them about how they feel about their work as opposed to necessarily about mental health. But the stigma and taboo still exists, and this makes it more difficult. There's also something really interesting about individual response to these risks, and there's a nuance, I think, in the psychosocial risk, which is less prevalent in much physical risk. Now, I'm aware that I'm not a health and safety risk management professional, so I may be missing some nuances here. But to put it in really kind of like blunt terms, you get hit by a forklift truck, it's going to hurt you whoever you are. But a stressful, a high pressure job, a job where people are having to, a high pressure sales job, for example, something like that, that is not necessarily harmful. It depends on the individual who's doing it. Some people absolutely thrive in those situations. Some people absolutely, that's what they want, that's what they need from their work. And for some people, find it very stressful, and that will be difficult. But the inverse is also true. So a job with low chance of promotion and fairly repetitive work, for some people, will be a psychosocial risk. There's the danger that they're going to become complacent with it because they don't want to do it. They're feeling like they're meaningless. They don't feel like they have purpose. It could be depressing and different, make them feel anxious about what am I doing with their life. For some people, it might be exactly what they want at that point in their career, or maybe given what else is going on in their life, maybe it's really comforting that that's all they do. So there is an individual response factor to be made to take into account alongside risk assessments, where thinking about, okay, just because this exists, is it for certain individuals in these teams? What kind of characteristics do we need to be aware of for the individuals? And finally, there is an interesting stakeholder management piece around ISO 45003 for organizations who are starting to bring their risk management teams to be involved in well-being and preventing mental health difficulties, problems. It's which is that well-being kind of usually already has an owner, and that de facto owner, it's usually HR. But sometimes it's like the engagement teams, or in some organizations it's the comms team, and in some organizations there is actually a well-being team. So it's a slightly different situation, and actually much of the work that I've done related to ISO 45003 has actually been facilitating these conversations. It's been about, okay, so how does that work now when you've got all of the expertise around risk assessment and risk reduction and identifying and mitigating risk sits in one part of the organization, and the people who currently own the policy and the people who currently drive the agenda are in a different part of the organization, and kind of linking that up and kind of making that work in the best way possible. It's just something to think about if you're interested or looking into the idea of ISO 45003 in your organization. It's not a there are probably other owners for mental health and well-being in the organization, and managing that is probably one of the more tricky aspects to navigate. So it's just really worth sort of flagging that up and thinking about how the best way to manage that is. And that is me. I've talked for 50 minutes. I really hope there's some questions.
Oh, there are lots of questions, Tim. Don't worry. Thank you ever so much for such an informative and interesting session. So let's kick off. That really, the first question is about your very last comments about who should be responsible for the standard within an organisation. This person says that they've got a bit of a conflict between HR and health and safety, and how do you what advice you could give to actually bridge that?
So as I just touched on that's actually quite a bit of the facilitation that I've done. So most of my ISO 45003 work with organisations has been around that. I think there is one of the first things that I've noticed. I don't think there is comfortably one owner in most businesses. I think there's a real opportunity for health and safety risk management functions to take a big leading role in this, because you have skills that don't exist elsewhere in the business in order to manage this and to make the change. But it has to happen in a way that is countered by the fact that, say, HR, for example, aren't really necessarily and especially if it doesn't sit in HR, because HR are used to dealing with the idea of risk from a point of view, risk to the business from tribunals or whatever. So they're not oblivious to this concept. If it sits somewhere like comms or engagement or well-being, it's a lot fluffier and it's a lot more of a difficult conversation, I think. So the idea mainly is kind of going, okay, thinking about, is what we're doing now working the way we want it to work? And starting to identify, even just like taking a team, and this is what we've done in I've done a couple of occasions, just identifying a team where there is clearly something to be looked at. There's some opportunity for improvement there, and just looking at it and going, okay, so what are the things that the current owners are doing in that team? How are they measuring it? What are they impacting? And then kind of going, okay, so let's do a risk assessment. And sort of walking those stakeholders through that process of risk assessment in as open and friendly and collaborative a manner as is possible, and kind of taking them to the point of going, okay, so the stuff that you're doing is sitting here, and that's providing training and giving information. And what we've done is we've identified some things here that actually isn't being touched by that, but we think will help. And just demonstrate and walking through it like that, kind of trying to take it, because if you can prove it in one area, then the idea starts to get legs and it starts to feel a little bit more achievable, if that makes sense, by the organization. So yeah, I think we sort of have to accept that there is another owner in the business. They're not going to be letting it go. So it's about working out how that becomes joint, how the different parts of the approach to it become jointly owned and work. And I think measurement is really important to that.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Next question then is, do you think that stress and anxiety is actually increasing, or is it perhaps that now it's becoming more recognized and also more acceptable and easier to talk about it?
It's a really, really interesting question. I think many of the things that we see, that we're seeing increases of nowadays have always been there, but people are just recognizing it. And so one of the things, there's a big crossover with this sort of culturally within organizations with things like inclusion and diversity. And the idea that, and occasionally I've run the odd seminar, people go, well, more people are offended nowadays than they used to be. Why are people more offended now? I said, well, no, it's more that like people have always been offended, but they've identified why they're offended, or they're able to speak out about it. And I think it's a similar kind of thing. I think people now have a language to talk about how they're feeling. Okay, I think there is a recognition that it's valid, that people are able to talk about it. I think also COVID made a massive difference with it. I think it opened up the conversation about well-being in organizations where there weren't already conversations about well-being. So I don't know that it is, I can't say it's definitely worse, and I can't say it's definitely that all of, that line is just getting bigger because it's been reported. I think what we do have are a perfect storm right now of changes happening in organizations and also in wider society, which, if not handled well, will contribute to increased levels of anxiety. So there's anyone who's ever trained as a mental health first aider will be aware of the stress bucket. This idea that we have everyone has a bucket of stress which fills up, and it's not how big the bucket is, it's about recognizing how full it is and knowing what you need to do to empty it. And it's a great analogy. I like it a lot. And I sort of feel like since COVID, and with a lot of the things that are happening at the moment, cost of living crisis and so on and so forth, everybody's bucket has a slightly higher level by default. And so we've all got a little bit less to work with. And so anything that can be done by employers and in the workplace to reduce the impact of work on people is going to be a good thing.
Okay, great, thank you. So this question is all about measuring stress levels in order to get a true reflection on how people feel, because a lot of people in their organization, they feel like actually covering up how they feel about stress and workload and things. So when they're doing well-being indexes or well-being surveys, they're not quite sure whether they're actually getting a true reflection of how people feel.
Yeah. No, okay, I can see that. It's a difficult circle. Measurement of well-being is a difficult circle to square, because what you're actually measuring is anything that's to do with how people feel is always going to be subjective, and there will always be people in organizations who justify or argue up or down the numbers because it's a squishy number. And we've got to be reckoned, we are dealing with people's feelings. This is going to be squishy. And this is another thing that I think a lot of us on the call will probably, I struggled with for a while, because, you've got to get used to it being a bit ambiguous and not quite as definite as we would like. But so I have a survey that I use in organizations called the Well Working Index. The way we got around that was we focused very specifically on the way people feel about their work. So we're not asking people, are you stressed? Or we're not asking people, are you anxious? Or we're not asking people to rate their well-being on a scale. We're specifically thinking about, okay, so do you always have enough time to finish the work that you're given, would be an example. Or do you, how much do you think about work when you're not working? Or and there are a couple of questions there about, how do you feel about going to work before you get, do you ever feel like, a sense of dread before starting work, or those kind of things. They're quite specific, and they're quite, so we, focus on, particular areas of work, but we try and do it in a way which is as objective as you can get, because you're asking people about the things they do every day, as opposed to them having to make some kind of subjective judgment about that. I think also you can think about what are the lagging indicators or the lagging measures that stress and anxiety would be a driver of. So thinking about productivity within teams, levels of sickness, those kind of things, you can take some sort of read off those as well. The measurement piece is still a bit sticky, and I don't think anybody's completely cracked it yet. There are a few organisations like who do apps and kind of ongoing pulse checking. There's one called, I think they're called Friday Pulse, something like that, who have got some really interesting correlations between their figures and organizational productivity and I think sickness absence. But there's whole organizations trying to make that happen. My advice would be to focus more on the things that you can measure around work and how do people feel about work, as opposed to whether people feel like they're stressed or anxious.
Okay, thank you. Next question then is sort of the converse of that. Any tips on dealing with employees who, despite advice and support, are still exhibiting signs of stress? So what can we do for these persistent behaviours? So these are people that are saying to their employer, you know, I'm feeling stressed, as the employer has reacted to that, putting in some investigations, but the employee is still exhibiting signs of stress.
I would be thinking about moving it away from the individual. So if you remember the 4 box, and where it's kind of individual to organizational versus and reactive versus proactive, I'll be thinking more about, okay, well, what are we doing at an organizational level that's led to this culture where this individual feels like actually they need to continue doing that? And actually, how do we what can we do at that work design engineering controls level to make it so that actually it doesn't really matter how he or she is behaving? We've got that the work is pushing them down a certain more healthy path. You know, and in some cases, you know, I've had, in some cases that could be really that can, you know, you have to be really careful how you manage it. I've seen it with individuals in certain cases where you've had individuals who are working long hours and aren't doing what they're asked to do, literally being taken from out of the building at the end of the day, and it being managed in that's a very sort of individual focused response, and that had all sorts of impacts on that person. Whereas actually starting to change the way that the team works, managing the expectation, kind of almost giving another way to approach that would be, okay, the team has a conversation, a stand up, whatever you want to call it, at the end of the day that closes the day off. And you kind of go, okay, so this is where we're at there, and then you sort of start to create a rhythm within the team where actually it's not necessary, and it is clear that it is not expected that people continue to work late, as an example. Also, leadership behavior is massively important to that. The idea of leaders leaving loudly, you know, or setting expectations through their behavior and through their role modeling. So it's no good saying to people, we don't want you working in the evenings if you've then got a leader who's sending emails at 11 o'clock at night. You know, it's got to be role modeled from the top, and so much of that is cultural. But I'd be looking at what are the things that individual is doing, or that's putting that pressure on, and starting to turn those dials rather than focusing on the individual.
Okay, thank you. And this sort of links to what you were just saying. Somebody's made really a comment. Is this really to do with the culture of the organisation?
100%, but then everything is. You know, and we didn't get to where we are from a physical health and safety risk management perspective we didn't do that without changing culture or without changing perceptions. You know, and I'm fairly certain, like in 1975, there was like similar conversations about how you change cultures in order to make it so that people feel able to do the things that they need to do in order to be safer at work. So yeah, it's everything's a cultural question as far as I'm concerned, especially in large organizations. But small organizations that grow quickly can end up in a situation where their working practices haven't scaled to meet demand, and so they develop habits, and the habits that you develop as an organization are as good a definition as culture as I can think of right now. So yeah, there is a point about changing what's acceptable in the organization, changing how people think about mental health, but changing how people think about their work as well, and removing this idea of people's work is there to deliver undefined output for the business at the end, and the business needs to just and can turn that tap open as open as it wants to, and just expect to see more and more work coming out of it. That's we all know that that's not sustainable. But that doesn't mean that you need more people necessarily. You need to look at the way that you work.
Okay.
I like the idea of people. The way I sometimes talk about it is that I think in many organizations, people are fighting their work to achieve what they need to achieve. And that's, something that leads to this, to anxiety and depression and burnout.
Okay, thank you. We've got 2 more questions at the moment. So the next one is all about managing psychosocial risk for 2 separate groups of workers. So this company has a small core office-based number of employees, but they also have a higher number of remote workers. And how do they manage those psychosocial risks across those 2 quite disparate groups?
So yeah, remote working is a really tough one. It's a really tough one. So I think about it from the point of view of the same way that you would any disparate group within an organization. So if you've got a set of office workers and you've got a set of people who work in a warehouse, you're not going to treat them as one population when you do your risk assessment. So I think there is very definitely a case of recognizing as you have that they're separate people with different things. Then I would look at it from the point of view of, so your risk assessment for your remote people is there's going to be an overlap with the people who are in the office. There's going to be stuff around work demands and stuff like that. So I would then be identifying what are the things that are likely to crop up as a result of people being remotely, And if you've, I assume that everyone has come across this, but maybe not. For this, I love a tool called pre-morteming, which is basically like, what's the worst that could happen? It's about, getting out. And the thing is, we're brilliant at that as people. Like, I think especially the British, in my experience, really, really good at working out what could possibly go wrong. And so just looking at going, right, what are the things that could be impacting those people who are working remotely that is different to what the people who are office based, and just get that, get a big list of like all the worst that could happen, and that will take you to that'll get you to it's a good starting point for where are the areas that we then need to look at from a point of view of maybe focus grouping or speaking to teams or starting to get input from them on. So it would be, for example, things like isolation, adequate communication, do they have, how are they set up work-wise, at home? Are they, do they feel that they have what they need from a point of view of direction, and do they feel trusted? So, a lot of these organizations are bringing in this kind of like spyware type thing that, makes people feel like they're maybe not trusted. So, how do you, if that is something that's a policy in the organization, how do you mitigate the potential negative impacts of that? So I would do that. I would try and catastrophize around what those people are likely to or possibly going to experience, and use that as a starting point to make the differentiation.
Okay, thank you. And final question at the moment. So the pandemic has had lasting impacts on mental health. How will support workers' mental health improve and be enhanced by the standard?
Support workers, as in, I'm not entirely sure that I understand that part of the question.
Okay, so I think what the person is asking for is people that are sort of, so let's say the admin support within an organization.
Okay, I think the standard's designed to, it's broad enough to enable you to look at and it's broad enough to enable you to look at any part of the business and kind of think, well, where are the places that, what are the things that are going to be individually impacting or people in individual roles? And I guess you can take it from the, I mean, it's encouraging you to just think about risk in a slightly broader way, I guess is the point. So the standard itself provides some framework, it provides some buckets, and it provides a bit of validation about this idea that of psychosocial risk that actually is a thing. That's why one of the reasons I got so excited when it was published, because I've been like banging my head against like general sort of like, no, actually, if you design your work differently, people are happier, people like being good at their jobs, therefore that's a good thing. But until a standard came out, no one was really listening. So but all it's doing is it's opening out that idea of risk to a broader thing. So actually going to look at the way that people work, and whether that is in a work that is a piece of work that is a low pressure, like low meaning. I don't really like that phrase, but you hear it a bit. Work, and does that give people the give them motivation and everything they need, or whether it's a more physical role. You know, physical roles that have physical risks don't not have psychosocial risks. You know, so is that there? And I'm also wondering whether support in this context could relate to people who work in roles that are supporting people who have, or you know, supporting people in a mental health capacity. So thinking about, a great example of this would be mental health first aiders. Organizations have been very quick to bring in mental health first aiders, and then are subsequently realizing that they need to put support networks in place to enable those mental health first aiders to do their jobs effectively. I think it's really about, in all of those cases, what this standard does is gives us a framework for assessing the risk to those people. So looking at what are the things that these people are exposed to on a day-to-day basis that are potentially going to impact their mental health. Now, if that is, in the case of those individuals, they are potentially going to be hearing or seeing things that are going to be troubling and or you know, have you know, traumatic, then there needs to be a network in place in order to mitigate that risk, in exactly the same way that there are for ambulance workers or for firefighters or any of those situations, police. You know, you need to, so it's thinking about that kind of those kind of frameworks, and it's not always going to be an easy answer, but yes, the pandemic has opened up people's acknowledgement of mental health and exposure to poor mental health. And in what this framework does is it just gives us a language, if you like, to think about it in ways that is a little bit more scientific and a little bit more actionable than we had previously.
Okay, thank you ever so much. I think those are all the questions we've had. There's some great questions there, thank you. Thanks, Tim, for sharing your knowledge with us this afternoon. Thanks to everybody that's joined us. I'll put the recording onto the IIRSM Resource Hub later today. So anything you want to catch up on or go over in your own time, feel free to do that. So we'll end the webinar here. Thank you ever so much for joining us. And I hope you all have a really good rest of your day. So we'll end things here. Thanks again, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.